My husband's family turned my life into a nightmare, and now I'm ready to walk away.
Hey Reddit, I'm Claire, 32, and I'm married to Nick, 34. We've been together for 10 years, married for 7, and what should have been the happiest years of my life have been overshadowed by the constant interference of Nick's family. His mom, Denise, 58, and his sister, Melissa, 29, have been in our business since day one.
From controlling our finances to manipulating Nick into prioritizing them over our own family, it's been one drama after another.
Things came to a head recently when Denise tried to sabotage our plans for a house, pushing Nick to buy a property that she could move into. I've had enough of their toxic behavior, and for the first time, I'm seriously considering leaving Nick if he doesn't start setting boundaries.
Here's how it all went down.
I met Nick when I was 22, fresh out of college, and working my first job as a graphic designer at a small advertising firm in Chicago. I had just moved to the city, still figuring out my way in the world, living in a tiny apartment that could barely fit my bed and a desk. Nick, who was 24 at the time, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. We met through a mutual friend at a rooftop bar on a warm summer evening. I still remember the first time I saw him, standing near the bar with that easy smile, wearing a crisp blue shirt that brought out his blue eyes. He exuded a kind of warmth and confidence that instantly drew me in. We hit it off right away, spending hours talking that night about everything from our favorite movies to our big dreams.
Nick was funny, easygoing, and had this way of making me feel completely at ease. By the end of the night, he asked for my number, and I remember feeling a rush of excitement as I handed him my phone. The next few months were a whirlwind of dates, long walks by the lake, late-night diner runs, and lazy Sundays spent watching movies. Nick made me feel safe and loved, and I fell for him hard. Nick came from a close-knit family, or at least, that's how he described it.
He was always talking about his mom, Denise, and his younger sister, Melissa, who was a few years younger than us. Denise had raised Nick and Melissa on her own after her husband died when Nick was just 10 years old. She worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and Nick often spoke about how strong and selfless she was. He idolized his mom and felt a deep sense of responsibility toward her, always wanting to make her proud. Melissa, on the other hand, was the baby of the family and had been spoiled her whole life. From what Nick told me, Denise had always coddled her, letting her get away with things that Nick never could. Melissa had a reputation for being a bit dramatic, always in the middle of some relationship crisis or job drama, and Nick was her go-to person for support. He was the classic big brother, always rushing to her aid, even when it meant putting his own needs last. I met Denise and Melissa for the first time about 6 months into our relationship, at a family dinner that Nick invited me to. I was nervous, I knew how much they meant to Nick, and I wanted to make a good impression. Denise greeted me with a polite smile, but her eyes felt like they were sizing me up, scrutinizing every aspect of my appearance. Melissa, on the other hand, was overly friendly, launching into stories about her latest boyfriend drama and gossiping about her co-workers. She had a way of dominating every conversation, talking over everyone, and making sure all eyes were on her.
Dinner felt more like an interview than a family gathering.
Denise kept asking pointed questions about my job, my family, and my plans for the future, all while making subtle digs that I'm not sure she even realized were insulting.
Oh, graphic design? That's interesting.
Nick always dated girls who were more into business and finance.
But hey, the creative types are fun too.
I laughed it off, but it was clear that Denise had strong opinions about the kind of woman she thought was worthy of her son.
Melissa wasn't much better.
She spent most of the evening complaining about her ex-boyfriend, making sure to paint herself as the victim in every scenario.
When I tried to offer some advice, she rolled her eyes and said, "You don't really get it, Claire. It's complicated." I left that night feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off. I loved Nick, and I wanted to make things work with his family, no matter how difficult they seemed. As our relationship progressed, so did the meddling. Denise and Melissa seemed to have an opinion on everything Nick did.
Denise would call him multiple times a day, asking for favors or just venting about her latest gripe, her neighbors, her bills, her health. Melissa, who still lived at home, would often drag Nick into her personal dramas, treating him more like a substitute father than a brother. I tried to be supportive, telling myself that this was just how their family operated. Nick had grown up feeling responsible for his mom and sister, and he was used to putting their needs above his own.
But the more time I spent around them, the more I realized how toxic the dynamic was. Denise's constant guilt trips and Melissa's selfish demands were wearing Nick down, but he couldn't see it, or maybe he didn't want to. Nick proposed to me on a snowy night in December, about 2 years after we started dating. It was simple and sweet, just the two of us in our favorite park, surrounded by twinkling Christmas lights. I was over the moon, excited to start planning our future together. But the moment we announced our engagement, Denise and Melissa swooped in, determined to control every aspect of our wedding. Denise immediately inserted herself into the planning process, insisting on being involved in every decision. She had strong opinions about everything, from the venue to the flowers to the guest list. "We need to invite all the cousins," she said one afternoon while flipping through my guest list, crossing out names and adding her own. "Family is everything, Claire. You don't want to start off on the wrong foot." She constantly made snide comments about my choices, acting as if I was deliberately excluding her when I didn't agree with her suggestions. Melissa was just as bad. She demanded to be my maid of honor, even though we weren't particularly close. She expected me to accommodate her every whim, from the style of the bridesmaid dresses to the bachelorette party plans. When I hesitated about making her the maid of honor, Melissa threw a fit, accusing me of trying to shut her out of her brother's big day. Nick, caught in the middle, urged me to let her have the role, saying it would keep the peace. I reluctantly agreed, not wanting to cause more drama, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being steamrolled. The day of the wedding was supposed to be magical, but Denise and Melissa made it anything but. From the moment we started getting ready, Denise was in full control mode, barking orders at the wedding planner, rearranging seating without asking, and hovering over the hair and makeup team, insisting they do things her way. She even tried to change the song I'd picked for my walk down the aisle, claiming that it wasn't traditional enough. Melissa was no better. She showed up late, complaining loudly about how exhausted she was from dealing with her latest breakup, and sulked through the entire ceremony because she didn't like the color of her bridesmaid dress. At the reception, she made snarky comments about how Nick was whipped and how she missed the old Nick who was always there for her. It felt like a competition to see who could overshadow our day the most. I felt like a guest at my own wedding. Instead of enjoying the moment, I was constantly on edge, trying to keep Denise and Melissa's drama from ruining everything. By the time Nick and I finally escaped to our honeymoon suite, I was emotionally drained and wondering what I'd gotten myself into. I loved Nick, but his family was proving to be a constant source of stress, and I didn't know how much more I could take. Update number 1: the house dispute and Denise's meddling. After the wedding, Nick and I started talking about buying our first house. We'd been saving up for years, and I was excited to finally have a place that was ours. But, of course, Denise and Melissa had other plans. Denise insisted on tagging along to every open house, offering unsolicited advice and steering us toward homes that were conveniently located near her. "You don't want to be too far away," she'd say, flipping through listings of homes that were way out of our budget. "What if you need help with the baby?" Melissa chimed in, too, suggesting that we look at houses with extra space so she could crash whenever she wanted. It was clear that they both envisioned our new home as an extension of theirs, and Nick, always the dutiful son, was caught in the middle. I felt like I was losing control of what should have been an exciting time in our lives. Instead of planning our future together, I was constantly battling Denise and Melissa's interference. After months of searching, Nick and I finally found a house we both loved. It was a charming mid-century home with a big backyard, a cozy fireplace, and enough space to start a family. I could already picture us raising kids there, hosting barbecues, and making it our own. But when we told Denise, she was less than thrilled. "It's too far from my house," she complained, wrinkling her nose as she glanced at the listing. "And it's not exactly impressive. Nick, you can do better." I was furious, but I tried to stay calm. Nick reassured me that Denise's opinion didn't matter, and we put in an offer on the house anyway. But Denise wasn't done meddling. A few days after we closed on the house, she showed up with a list of suggestions for renovations, most of which involved turning the basement into a fully equipped apartment that she could use whenever she wanted. "I'm just thinking ahead," she said with a smile, acting as if it was the most reasonable idea in the world. I lost it. I'd been biting my tongue for years, trying to keep the peace, but this was too much.
I pulled Nick aside and told him that I was done letting his mom dictate our lives.
This is our home, Nick.
Not hers, I said, my voice trembling with anger.
We can't keep letting her control everything. Nick looked conflicted, torn between me and his mom.
I know, Claire, he said quietly. I just don't want to hurt her feelings. But his hesitation spoke volumes. It was clear that Nick was still caught in Denise's web, and I felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. That night, I went to bed feeling more alone than ever, wondering if Nick would ever be able to put our family first.
About a year after we moved into our new house, I found out I was pregnant. I was ecstatic.
For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about our future. I planned a special dinner to surprise Nick with the news, cooking his favorite meal and setting up a little gift box with a baby onesie inside. When he opened it, his face lit up, and he pulled me into the biggest hug. For a moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. But as soon as we announced the pregnancy, Denise and Melissa swooped in, determined to take over.
Denise immediately started buying baby clothes, furniture, and nursery decor without asking us what we wanted.
She even set up a grandma room in her own house, complete with a crib and changing table, acting as if she was going to be Oliver's primary caregiver. Melissa was just as bad, constantly making comments about how she'd be the cool aunt and how I needed to loosen up when it came to parenting. I tried to set boundaries, telling Denise that while we appreciated her enthusiasm, we wanted to do things our way.
But Denise wasn't having it.
She'd show up unannounced with bags of baby clothes and toys, insisting that we needed certain items even when I politely declined. She'd make snide remarks about my plans for the nursery, acting as if her opinion was the only one that mattered. Every time I pushed back, she'd act hurt, playing the victim and accusing me of shutting her out. Melissa, too, was constantly inserting herself into our lives, making offhand comments about how she couldn't wait to babysit and how I'd better not be one of those controlling moms who wouldn't let anyone else take care of the baby. I was already feeling overwhelmed with the pregnancy, and their constant interference only added to my stress. Nick tried to play peacemaker, but his lack of boundaries with his family was driving me insane.
I felt like I was constantly fighting for control over my own life, and it was exhausting.
The final straw came when Denise announced that she was planning a grandma shower for herself, inviting all her friends to celebrate her new role. She sent out elaborate invitations with baby-themed decorations and a picture of a baby bottle with grandma to be written on it. It felt like another way for her to make our pregnancy all about her. When I confronted Nick about how uncomfortable it made me, he shrugged it off, saying, "It's just Denise being Denise.
Let her have this." I couldn't believe how dismissive he was of my feelings.
I felt like I was constantly being overshadowed, like my role as Oliver's mom was being hijacked by Denise before he was even born. I realized then that Nick was never going to stand up to his family unless something changed, and I was losing hope that it ever would.
Update number 2, the birth and the in-laws overstepping.
The day I went into labor was supposed to be one of the most memorable days of our lives, but of course, Denise found a way to insert herself into the moment. I'd made it clear to Nick that I only wanted him in the delivery room with me, and he'd promised to respect my wishes. But as we were getting ready to leave for the hospital, Denise showed up unannounced, insisting that she needed to be there for support. I was already in pain, anxious, and overwhelmed, and the last thing I needed was Denise hovering over me, making everything about her. Nick, caught in his usual conflict-avoidant mode, told Denise that she could wait in the hospital lobby. I was too focused on getting through labor to argue, but it felt like yet another boundary crossed. Denise and Melissa camped out in the waiting room for hours, constantly texting Nick for updates and demanding to be let in. When Oliver was finally born, Nick stepped out to let them know, and within minutes, they were barging into my hospital room, ignoring the nurse's instructions to give us time to rest. Denise swooped in, grabbing Oliver from my arms without asking, and immediately started critiquing everything. "Are you sure you're holding him right?" she asked, adjusting his blanket. "He looks cold. Maybe you should let me take him for a bit." I was too tired to fight back, but inside, I was seething. I'd barely had a moment to bond with my own baby before Denise and Melissa took over, acting like they were the ones in charge.
Melissa was no better.
She spent the entire time snapping selfies with Oliver, posting them on social media with captions like, "Best auntie ever," and "So blessed to be part of this little one's life."
I hadn't even had a chance to announce Oliver's birth myself, and here was Melissa, broadcasting every moment as if it were her own. It felt like they were stealing every special moment from me, turning what should have been our family's time into their own personal show. I told Nick how upset I was, but he just looked helpless. "They're excited, Claire," he said, as if that made everything okay. I felt completely dismissed, like my feelings didn't matter, and it was clear that Nick was never going to stand up to his family. When we brought Oliver home, Denise continued to overstep. She'd show up unannounced nearly every day, critiquing my parenting and offering help that often felt more like sabotage. She'd undermine my decisions, telling me that Oliver didn't need to be swaddled, that I was holding him too much, or that my choice of organic baby food was just a fad. Melissa would drop by with her latest boyfriend, treating our home like a social club where she could parade Oliver around like a trophy. I was at my wit's end. I was sleep-deprived, overwhelmed, and desperately trying to adjust to being a new mom, but Denise and Melissa's constant presence made it impossible to find any peace. I tried to talk to Nick about setting firmer boundaries, but he always had an excuse for their behavior. "They're just trying to help," he'd say, even when it was clear that their help was doing more harm than good. As Oliver got older, things with Denise and Melissa only got worse. They'd criticize everything from our parenting choices to our finances, constantly inserting themselves into conversations that were none of their business. Denise, in particular, had this way of making us feel like we owed her something, like her sacrifices as a single mom gave her the right to dictate how we lived our lives. The financial manipulation started subtly. Denise would casually mention how tight money was and how she was struggling to keep up with her bills. She'd drop hints about needing help, saying things like, "I don't know how I'm going to afford the car repairs this month," or "I've been thinking about downsizing, but it's just so stressful." Nick, ever the dutiful son, would immediately offer to help, even when we couldn't really afford it. It all came to a head when Nick and I started having serious conversations about our finances. We'd been stretched thin since Oliver's birth, with medical bills, daycare costs, and the mortgage piling up. I suggested we cut back on unnecessary expenses, including the frequent gifts Nick was buying for Denise and Melissa, things like paying off Melissa's credit card debt or covering Denise's car repairs. Nick listened, but I could tell he was struggling with the idea of saying no to his family. When I finally put my foot down and told Nick that we needed to prioritize our own family, he got defensive. "They've done so much for me," he argued. "I can't just turn my back on them." I tried to explain that helping them didn't mean bankrupting our own family, but Nick couldn't see past his guilt. It was like he was trapped in this cycle of obligation, constantly trying to make up for his dad's absence by being everything Denise and Melissa demanded of him. The breaking point came when Denise asked Nick to co-sign on a loan for a new car she couldn't afford. She'd wrecked her old one in a minor accident and decided she deserved an upgrade. When Nick hesitated, Denise went full guilt trip mode, reminding him of how she'd sacrificed everything for him and how she deserved a little help in return. I was furious. We were struggling to make ends meet, and here was Denise, demanding that Nick put our financial future at risk for her own selfish needs. I told Nick flat out that he needed to say no, that we couldn't afford to keep bailing his family out. But Denise didn't take no for an answer. She showed up at our house in tears, sobbing about how she couldn't get around without a new car and how she was so disappointed that Nick was turning his back on her. I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped, telling Denise that we were done being her safety net and that she needed to start taking responsibility for her own life. Nick just stood there, looking helpless and torn, as Denise turned her anger on me. "You've changed him," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You've poisoned him against his own family." It was like every fear I'd ever had about being the villain in their story was being thrown back in my face. I realized then that no matter how hard I tried, I would always be the outsider, the woman who took Nick away from his real family. Update number 3, taking a stand in the fallout. After that blowout with Denise, I told Nick that I was done tolerating his family's toxic behavior. I gave him an ultimatum, set boundaries, or I was walking away. Nick looked devastated, like he couldn't believe it had come to this, but I was at my breaking point. I loved Nick, but I couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of his family's manipulations. We started therapy, both individually and as a couple, to try and untangle the mess of emotions that had been festering for years. It was hard.
Our therapist, Dr. Mitchell, helped Nick see how his family's constant demands were affecting our marriage, but Nick struggled to break free from the guilt that Denise had instilled in him since childhood. It was like he was stuck in this cycle of feeling responsible for everyone's happiness but his own. One particularly eye-opening session came when Dr. Mitchell asked Nick to list all the ways he'd put his mom and sister's needs above our own. Nick hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but as he started talking, it was like a floodgate opened. He admitted that he'd been scared to set boundaries because he didn't want to be seen as a bad son or bad brother. I watched as the realization hit him that he'd been prioritizing his family's happiness over ours, and that it was slowly destroying our marriage. It wasn't a quick fix, but Nick started to make changes. He stopped answering Denise's daily calls, set limits on how often Melissa could come over, and even confronted Denise about her constant guilt trips. It wasn't perfect, and there were plenty of setbacks, but for the first time, I felt like Nick was actually fighting for us. But Denise didn't take kindly to the new boundaries. She accused Nick of abandoning her, calling him selfish and ungrateful. She even went so far as to spread rumors among the extended family, painting me as the manipulative wife who was tearing her precious son away. Family gatherings became tense, with whispered conversations and judgmental stares directed my way. I felt like I was constantly being judged, and it was exhausting. Melissa was just as bad, constantly undermining our decisions and making passive-aggressive comments about how Nick had changed since we got married. She'd show up unannounced, complaining about her latest breakup or financial crisis, and expect Nick to drop everything to fix her problems. But this time, Nick started saying no. He told Melissa that he couldn't keep bailing her out, that she needed to start standing on her own 2 feet. Melissa, predictably, threw a fit, accusing Nick of turning his back on his family and storming out in tears. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It was validating to see Nick finally setting boundaries, but it was also heartbreaking to watch him struggle with the fallout. I knew how much he loved his family, and it hurt to see him caught in the crossfire of their manipulations. But I also knew that we couldn't keep living like this, constantly torn between our own needs and the demands of his family. With Denise and Melissa's influence finally starting to wane, Nick and I began to focus on rebuilding our marriage. We started spending more quality time together, going on dates, and reconnecting in ways we hadn't since before Oliver was born. It was like we were rediscovering each other after years of being lost in the chaos of his family's drama. I also started setting my own boundaries, something I'd struggled with for years. I stopped trying to please Denise and Melissa, stopped bending over backward to keep the peace. I realized that I didn't need their approval, and that my worth wasn't defined by their opinions of me. It was liberating, but it was also a long road to unlearning the people-pleasing tendencies that had been ingrained in me for so long. Nick and I continued therapy, working through the resentment and hurt that had built up over the years. Dr. Mitchell helped us navigate the tricky dynamics of setting boundaries with family while still maintaining a relationship, but it wasn't easy. Denise and Melissa were resistant to change, constantly pushing back and testing our resolve. But Nick was determined. He'd seen the toll that their behavior had taken on our marriage, and he was committed to protecting the life we were trying to build. We also made the decision to limit our financial support to Denise and Melissa. It was a difficult conversation, especially with Nick still grappling with his sense of obligation, but we both knew it was necessary. We set clear limits on how much we were willing to help, making it clear that we wouldn't be bailing them out of every crisis. Denise, predictably, wasn't happy, but Nick held firm. He told her that he loved her, but that he had to prioritize his own family now. Melissa's response was just as dramatic. She accused Nick of abandoning her, of changing and letting me control him. But Nick stood his ground, calmly explaining that he couldn't keep sacrificing our family's well-being to fix her mistakes. It wasn't the response she wanted, but it was a step in the right direction for us. Update number 4: Moving forward and reclaiming our lives. It's been a year since we set those boundaries, and while things with Denise and Melissa are still tense, Nick and I are finally finding our footing. We've built a stronger foundation for our marriage, one that's based on mutual respect and open communication. It hasn't been easy, but we're committed to doing the work, both individually and together. Nick's relationship with his family is still a work in progress. He's learning to navigate the guilt and the emotional manipulation that's been ingrained in him since childhood,
and he's making strides every day. We've had to make some tough decisions, like skipping family events where we know there will be drama, but we're doing what's best for us and our son. As for Denise and Melissa, they're still figuring out how to adjust to the new dynamics. Denise still tries to overstep, but Nick has gotten better at setting boundaries and enforcing them. Melissa's cooled off a bit, though she still has her moments of drama. But Nick and I are no longer willing to let their behavior dictate our lives. I've also started focusing on myself again. I've gone back to work part-time as a graphic designer, something I'd put on hold after Oliver was born, and it's been amazing to reconnect with my passions. I've been spending more time with friends, picking up old hobbies, and just enjoying the little moments that make life worth living. Nick and I have even started talking about having another baby, something I never thought I'd want after all the stress we went through with Oliver's birth. It feels like a fresh start, a chance to build our family on our own terms, without the constant interference of Nick's family weighing us down. Final update, choosing ourselves. Hey Reddit, it's Claire again. I wanted to update you all on how things have been going and to thank you for the support and advice over the past year. Nick and I have come a long way from where we started, and while things aren't perfect, we're finally in a place where we're prioritizing our own happiness and well-being. Setting boundaries with Nick's family has been one of the hardest things we've ever done, but it's also been the most freeing. We've reclaimed our lives, our marriage, and our sense of peace. Nick's still working through his guilt, and I'm still learning to stand up for myself, but we're doing it together, and that's what matters. To anyone dealing with toxic in-laws or family dynamics, just know that it's okay to set boundaries. You don't owe anyone your happiness, and you have the right to protect your peace. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Nick and I are proof that you can come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and ready to build the life you deserve. Thanks for being part of our journey. Here's to new beginnings, to standing up for ourselves, and to choosing the life we want to live.